The Ardennes forest represented a formidable natural defense across Western Europe. It was a vast, sprawling wilderness of steep, wooded hills, deep river valleys, and winding, often unpaved tracks. The terrain's density seemed to defy any major mechanized military operation, especially during the harsh winter months. German strategists held a deep-seated conviction that this very geography rendered the area essentially impassable to large-scale armored thrusts. They believed the narrow, frost-bitten roads and the numerous, sudden bottlenecks would swallow up any significant offensive movement in a quagmire of mud and logistical chaos. This belief was not mere arrogance but a calculation rooted in military doctrine and the observable facts of the landscape. The ancient forest stood as a seemingly insurmountable barrier, a tacit line of defense that the Wehrmacht felt no sane opponent would seriously challenge. Its numerous small bridges were fragile, its hills were steep, and the lack of a modern, extensive road network meant that movement would be agonizingly slow and predictable. Therefore, the German High Command chose to mass their main defensive and offensive efforts elsewhere, leaving the Ardennes lightly guarded by inexperienced or exhausted divisions. The cold, wet European winter merely amplified the forest's already significant defensive attributes. Any breakthrough attempt would inevitably grind to a halt, or so the planners in Berlin and the field commanders in the West assured themselves. This miscalculation would become one of the most pivotal and costly errors of the entire conflict, an error built upon a flawed understanding of their enemy's sheer industrial might and engineering capability. The German strategy hinged on the assumption that nature itself was an ally against modern mobile warfare in this specific locale. They trusted the impassability of the environment more than they respected the resourcefulness of the American war machine. The dense canopy blocked aerial reconnaissance, making observation and targeting extremely difficult for any attacking force. The rolling hills concealed troop movements, offering short, localized fields of fire but preventing coordinated, large-scale maneuver. It was a place where tanks became targets and logistics chains became single, brittle threads. This ingrained belief in the Ardennes' defensive strength lulled the German command into a dangerous state of complacency that Christmas season. The forest was a silent giant guarding the path to the heart of the Third Reich. The German High Command, including Hitler himself, viewed the Ardennes as a place of sanctuary, not a staging ground. Their doctrine prioritized holding the vital industrial zones and strong defensive lines further north and south. The 1940 offensive, which had indeed punched through the forest, was considered an anomaly, a fluke achieved against a poorly prepared French defense and under different seasonal conditions. By late 1944, the Wehrmacht was convinced that the Allies would never risk their precious armored reserves in such treacherous, road-poor country. The strategic mindset was rigid, anchored to the idea that the laws of physics and logistics were immutable and favored the defender in this specific geography. This overconfidence became a monumental blind spot in the German intelligence and operational planning. They underestimated the Allies' determination and, critically, their unparalleled capacity for infrastructural warfare. The very terrain that the Germans considered their shield, they also considered a limiting factor for their own counterattacks, making them slow to react to initial breaches. The German belief in the forest's defense meant that they conserved resources by deploying only 4 divisions in the sector, many of them convalescent or newly formed. These thin forces were considered adequate simply because the terrain was the primary obstacle, not the defending troops. They failed to grasp the concept that American industry had produced machines that could fundamentally alter the face of the battlefield itself. For the Wehrmacht, Engineering was about building fortifications and repairing existing infrastructure, not about rapid, frontline ground modification. The concept of a massive, mobile fleet of earth-moving equipment deployed with the attacking infantry and armor was foreign to their tactical thinking. This strategic oversight meant that when the Battle of the Bulge began, the German surprise attack was met not just by brave soldiers, but by a force that could literally pave its own way through the assumed impassable barriers. The German forces initially succeeded in their surprise, but the subsequent failure to anticipate the speed of the American response was the true operational disaster. The Wehrmacht had planned for a war of attrition dictated by the landscape, but the Americans were preparing for a war of rapid mobility dictated by superior engineering. This fundamental difference in perception sealed the fate of the last major German offensive in the West. The shadow of the 1940 campaign loomed large over all strategic decisions regarding the Ardennes. In that lightning-fast invasion, the Wehrmacht had succeeded where others thought it impossible, threading their way through the forest and bypassing the heavily fortified Maginot Line. However, the nature of that 1940 victory was often misinterpreted by the later generation of German planners. They focused on the fact of the breakthrough, but minimized the significant logistical pain and temporary chaos that the terrain had inflicted even then. The 1940 advance was achieved against a French military that was mentally and physically unprepared for mobile warfare, a crucial difference from the battle-hardened Allies of 1944. Furthermore, the scale of forces deployed in 1944 was vastly greater, creating logistical requirements that far exceeded the demands of the earlier, swifter campaign. The later German assessment of the Ardennes became a self-fulfilling prophecy of defense, blinding them to its potential as a thoroughfare for the enemy. The 1940 experience suggested that with extreme effort, one could pass through the Ardennes, but it did not suggest that a modern, fully supplied army could sustain a major offensive through it. The German planners, operating under resource constraints, saw the forest as a natural check on Allied power that would allow them to reallocate precious divisions elsewhere. They saw the deep, frozen ruts of the logging roads as an insurmountable problem for heavy American tanks and supply trucks. The ghost of the 1940 success led them to a fatal error in reverse logic. If they struggled with the logistics then, the Allies must surely be deterred now. They failed to account for the evolution of American engineering and the prioritization of mobility in the U.S. Army doctrine. This historical precedent, ironically, created a false sense of security for the Wehrmacht in the critical winter of 1944. The memory of the past triumph made them complacent about the future threat. They discounted the immense logistical lessons the Allies had learned since the Normandy invasion, particularly the need for reliable road networks. The arrival of the American Engineering Corps was the ultimate antidote to the Wehrmacht's geographical assumptions. These soldiers were not just builders, they were combat engineers, trained to fight with a rifle in one hand and a tool in the other. The U.S. Army had learned a harsh truth during the campaigns in North Africa and Italy: you could not fight a mobile war without a guaranteed supply line, and supply lines needed roads. As a result, American forces were accompanied by a massive, dedicated fleet of earth-moving equipment and highly skilled construction units. When the German counteroffensive crashed through the thin American lines in December 1944, the initial chaos was immense, and the roads quickly became clogged. However, the immediate, tactical priority of the American command shifted instantly from simply fighting to actively engineering the battlefield. Engineer battalions were rushed forward, often taking up defensive positions as infantry, but their main task was to keep the lifeline roads open and to immediately build new ones. Their job was to turn a narrow, single-lane track into a passable, two-way military highway, sometimes within a matter of hours. They repaired hastily demolished German obstacles, laid down corduroy roads of logs over muddy sections, and blasted rock to widen existing passes. The engineers' presence was the physical manifestation of American logistical might, a clear signal that this army would not be dictated by the terrain. They worked day and night in freezing temperatures, often under direct German artillery fire, understanding that every minute saved on a road meant tanks and ammunition reaching the besieged front line. These men were the unsung heroes who neutralized the Wehrmacht's greatest defensive ally, the forest itself. They transformed the strategic calculus by ensuring that American armor and supplies could move at a speed the German planners believed impossible. The combat engineers essentially took the impassable off the map, section by brutal section. The American bulldozer, specifically the powerful Caterpillar D7, was the true unsung weapon of the Ardennes campaign. It was a machine of relentless, quiet power, capable of achieving feats of landscape modification that infantry alone could only dream of. These heavy machines were designed for civilian construction, but in the hands of the U.S. Army, they became instruments of military victory. The D7 could push through thickets of trees, quickly clear debris and demolished vehicles, and, most importantly, grade a rough track into a usable roadbed. Where German tanks bogged down in the churned mud and snow, the bulldozers simply brute forced their way through, creating the necessary foundation for all subsequent movement. Their work was a continuous, earth-shaking rumble in the frozen woods, a sound that signaled the doom of the German counteroffensive. The engineers realized that the speed of the counterattack was entirely dependent on the speed of their earth-moving machines. They utilized the bulldozers not just for road construction but also for rapidly digging vehicle revetments and defensive fighting positions in the frozen soil. This equipment gave the American defense an unprecedented agility, allowing units to be pulled out of one sector and quickly move to reinforce another before the Germans could react. The silent, unglamorous work of these machines contrasted sharply with the thunderous roar of artillery and the clatter of tank tracks. Yet, it was the persistent scraping of the bulldozer blade against frozen earth that determined the pace of the entire battle. The presence of the D7S meant that even if a road was destroyed, it would only be a temporary inconvenience, not a fatal blockage. They were the ultimate manifestation of American industrial capacity, deployed directly onto the front lines to overcome a purely geographical challenge. The initial German thrust created a logistical nightmare for the Allies, characterized by choked roads, confused traffic flow, and deep bottlenecks. The retreating and reinforcing American units quickly overloaded the fragile, existing road network of the Ardennes. The combat engineers were immediately tasked with untangling this immense knot of men and material, recognizing that logistics would win or lose the battle. Their work was systematic and brutal, involving the removal of hundreds of tons of wreckage, the leveling of shell craters, and the constant improvement of road surfaces. They implemented rigid one-way traffic systems on key routes, allowing supplies to flow forward and wounded to move rearward without interruption. The bulldozers widened narrow tracks into military-grade avenues, often doubling the effective capacity of the road network in a matter of hours. This ability to rapidly create and enforce a functional logistical architecture transformed the battle from a desperate, localized struggle into a coordinated, massive defensive operation. The Germans, relying on limited transport and poor road conditions for their own advance, were stunned by the resilience of the American supply chain. Every time a German demolition team blew a bridge, an American engineering team was already assembling a prefabricated Bailey bridge to replace it, often in a fraction of the time. The engineers' constant maintenance and improvement meant that American forces could shift entire divisions across the battlefield with shocking rapidity. This logistical superiority allowed for the crucial reinforcement of key towns like Bastogne, turning potential German successes into grinding, resource-draining sieges. The transformation from a chaotic retreat to a steady, organized defense was entirely predicated on the engineers' success in mastering the ground. They ensured that every rifle, every shell, and every gallon of fuel reached its destination, effectively nullifying the environmental advantage the Wehrmacht had banked on. Maintaining the flow of vital supplies was the most critical function performed by the American engineers in the dense, hostile Ardennes. The forest's numerous small creeks and ravines, while seemingly minor, necessitated hundreds of small bridges and culverts, all potential choke points. German demolition teams made these vulnerable points their primary targets, hoping to sever the American logistical arteries. The engineers, however, were prepared with an arsenal of bridging equipment, most famously the sectional steel Bailey Bridge. These prefabricated structures could be assembled by hand in a surprisingly short amount of time, often while enemy fire was still falling. They spanned gaps quickly and efficiently, restoring the flow of tanks and trucks within hours instead of the days or weeks the Germans had calculated. The engineers also utilized heavy equipment to dredge riverbeds and install massive drainage pipes, preventing the constant, freezing rain from turning the roads into impassable swamps. Every newly built or repaired bridge, every graded road section, was a deliberate defeat of the German strategic plan. It allowed the Americans to feed their front lines with the overwhelming material advantage that American industry provided. The continuous stream of fuel, ammunition, and food moving down the newly opened arteries provided the defenders with the stamina to withstand the surprise attack. The engineers' work was a direct, physical refutation of the German belief in the forest's impassability. They turned the small, winding route of the Ardennes into a reliable, high-capacity highway system for a modern, mobile army. This relentless, unceasing effort to open and maintain the supply arteries was a pivotal factor in halting the German momentum. The initial success of the German panzer divisions was predicated on speed and the expectation of minimal resistance from the terrain. However, as the Americans brought their engineering might to bear, the German advantage began to rapidly erode. The panzers, though formidable, were still beholden to the logistical requirements of fuel and maintenance. They quickly found that the roads they needed to take, which the Americans had just utilized, were now being fiercely defended by newly arrived, fresh units. The German timetable, which relied on the roads slowing down the American reaction, was thrown into utter disarray. The unexpectedly rapid movement of American forces to key junctions and towns like Saint-Vith and Bastogne created solid, unyielding roadblocks. The German High Command, which assumed the Americans would be mired in the mud and snow, was forced to confront a rapidly reinforcing enemy. Their advanced spearheads soon outran their own limited supplies and were unable to break through the engineered defenses. The inability of the German supply chain to keep up with the initial breakthrough speed became a fatal flaw. While American engineers were opening up new roads, German logistics units were struggling with primitive, overworked supply lines. The panzers eventually stalled, not just from direct combat, but from a critical lack of fuel and replacement parts. The road to the Meuse, the Germans' ultimate objective, was paved with good American engineering intentions and fortified with American steel. The combination of the bulldozers' rapid road creation and the combat engineers' quick-fire fortification ended the German offensive momentum. The battle against the elements was almost as fierce as the battle against the Wehrmacht. The cold, wet snow and freezing rain were constant enemies of motion, threatening to turn every dirt track into an insurmountable slush field. The engineers worked tirelessly against this meteorological assault, recognizing the critical importance of keeping the roads consistently clear and stable. They utilized the bulldozers not just as construction tools but as giant, continuous snowplows. The D7S and their operators worked in non-stop shifts, pushing snow off the roads to prevent dangerous buildup and subsequent icing. In particularly boggy or unstable sections, they employed the technique of corduroy roading, laying down thousands of logs side by side to create a stable, temporary surface. This constant effort ensured that the speed of the American counterreaction did not drop, even as the winter conditions worsened. The Wehrmacht, with fewer heavy engineering assets, was much more susceptible to the winter's paralyzing effects. Their movement became slow and predictable, while the American military machine maintained a relative degree of fluidity. The engineers' ability to rapidly overcome the environmental challenges was a key factor in swinging the strategic momentum. They fought not just to move forward, but to ensure that they could always move at all, which was a luxury the German attackers soon lost. The dedication of these cold, exhausted men, who prioritized the functionality of the road over their own comfort, kept the American forces in the fight. The work of the engineers seamlessly transitioned from defensive stabilization to offensive preparation. Once the initial German breakthrough was contained, the priority shifted to enabling the massive Allied counterattack to roll forward. The roads that were stabilized for defense now served as the launching pads for American and British armor. Engineer battalions were attached directly to attacking armored divisions, with the specific mission of moving ahead of the main forces. Their job was to clear mines, remove booby traps, and instantly repair any damage inflicted by retreating German demolition teams. The sight of a bulldozer leading an M for Sherman tank down a newly graded road became a symbolic image of the Allied return to the offensive. This forward-deployed engineering capacity ensured that the counterattack maintained its speed and cohesion. It prevented the kind of logistical bogdown that had plagued the earlier stages of the battle. The engineers' ability to quickly breach German obstacles and re-establish damaged infrastructure denied the retreating enemy any opportunity to consolidate a new, stable defensive line. They built temporary airfields, established forward supply depots, and maintained the flow of fuel and ammunition crucial for the sustained push. The success of the American and British counteroffensives was a direct function of the engineers' ability to rapidly prepare and maintain the necessary infrastructure. The forest, which was meant to be the Wehrmacht's refuge, was now the scene of their organized, mechanized defeat. The ultimate failure of the Battle of the Bulge for the Wehrmacht can be traced back to a fatal underestimation of American logistical capability. German strategists had studied the map of the Ardennes and saw insurmountable natural features. American strategists looked at the same map and saw problems that could be solved with steel, diesel, and trained men. The German High Command never fully accounted for the immense industrial capacity of the United States. They did not grasp the sheer volume of engineering equipment and personnel that could be deployed to the front lines. The German belief was rooted in an old-world military doctrine where the land was the primary controller of movement. The American military, by contrast, had embraced a new paradigm where technology was used to dominate and modify the land. This conceptual failure cost the Wehrmacht dearly in time and resources. Every day the American engineers managed to save in bridge or road repair was a day lost for the German offensive. The German intelligence had focused on troop strength and armored columns, but entirely missed the threat posed by the Caterpillar D7 bulldozer. The speed with which the Allies were able to stabilize their lines, reinforce key positions, and launch a counterattack was the direct result of this engineering superiority. The Wehrmacht assumed a 5-day delay due to terrain. The American engineers often reduced that to less than 24 hours. This underestimation of the soft power of American industry and engineering was the true undoing of the entire offensive. The story of the Ardennes is a powerful testament to the decisive role of military engineering in modern warfare. The battle was not solely won by the infantry in the foxholes or the tankers in their armored machines. It was also won by the combat engineers, who wielded the bulldozer, the shovel, and the charge of dynamite. Their tireless work ensured that the vast industrial power of the United States could be effectively projected onto the frozen battlefield. The legacy of the American engineer in the Ardennes is a lesson that terrain is only a temporary obstacle to a determined and well-equipped force. The roads and bridges they built in the brutal winter of 1944 were not just temporary fixes, they were the essential foundation for the final push into Germany. Today, the modern roads that wind through the peaceful Ardennes still follow many of the paths first cleared and graded by those wartime bulldozers. Their effort created a permanent strategic change, turning a perceived natural barrier into a viable, modern thoroughfare. The men of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers may have lacked the glory of the frontline fighters, but they provided the essential mechanism for victory. They conquered the one enemy that the German High Command was certain would hold, the forest itself. The Ardennes was indeed impassable, but only until the Americans arrived with their superior engineering capability.